Unfortunately, I couldn't make it to World Aquaculture this year, but nevertheless, through an audio recording, I'll summarize how we optimize the natural production of Artemia on Great Salt Lake, and then really focus on some of the more recent developments. So first, we'll summarize the efforts of the last 30 years in managing the lake. Then we'll take a look forward with an emphasis on active nutrient management, legislative and funding efforts, as well as giving an example of an effective recent public-private partnership. And then finally, we'll present the historic Great Salt Lake cyst production and contrast that against worldwide cyst production. So let's start with a short historical overview. In 1951, Artemia harvest started on Great Salt Lake. A little bit later in 1959, a causeway, a dam, if you will, was constructed across the lake, effectively dividing the lake in two parts. Now, this is a really important event, as that causeway will end up being an essential tool to manage salinity and possibly also manage nutrients in the south arm of Great Salt Lake. 3.5 decades later, in 1993, the Artemia harvesting industry came together and formed the Utah Artemia Association. And this is really the first time that the industry truly worked together in support of the Great Salt Lake. And therefore, it's really not a coincidence that just a year later, the state of Utah, upon the request of the industry and with the support of the industry, created the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Project, which was tasked with researching and managing the lake. We fast forward another 17 years, and then the Utah State Legislature creates by law the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council. Now, this council is tasked with advising the governor of the state of Utah about matters related to Great Salt Lake. These two events are really very important, as one of them laid the groundwork in providing technical solutions to managing the lake, whereas the other laid the groundwork to provide future policy responses. And as a result of these efforts, we see that in 2023, the Utah government created the position of a Great Salt Lake Commissioner, who is responsible for coordinating efforts amongst all state agencies to manage the lake. And then another very important milestone for us is that in 2023, the Artemia fishery on Great Salt Lake obtained Marine Stewardship Council certification. And frankly, we're really proud to mention that we're not only the first inland fishery in the US to obtain that certification, but also the first Artemia fishery worldwide to obtain that certification. So how did that Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program shape these technical solutions? Well, long-term studies of the Artemia population supported the development of the adaptive sustainable harvest management model. Long-term studies of the nutrient inflows, nutrient cycling, and phytoplankton population supported future nutrient management decisions. Long-term studies of abiotic factors such as salinity laid the groundwork for future salinity management decisions. Microcosm studies looked at the interactions between temperature, salinity, phytoplankton, and Artemia, which then helped us model future conditions and supported management actions on the lake. And finally, these long-term studies of the avian population helped us understand the importance of Artemia in support of avian species. Then how did that Great Salt Lake Advisory Council help shape these policy actions? Well, the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council commissioned multiple studies to support future policy actions. And here are just a few examples of these important studies. There was a study on the economic value of Great Salt Lake, which revealed that value to be $1.3 billion per year to the state of Utah. There was a study on the total cost to the state of Utah if the state were to lose the Great Salt Lake, which is estimated at $2.1 to $2.8 billion a year. And there was also the development of a Great Salt Lake integrated model, which really helped model the impacts of different water conservation actions on the level of Great Salt Lake. And there were many other interesting studies, but really too much to go into detail in this presentation. So let's dig just a little bit deeper into these last 30 years of Great Salt Lake resource management in support of the Artemia population. Harvest management started in '96 with the development of an adaptive management model It was based on creating or reaching an optimal escapement stock of first originally 21 cysts per liter, but that has now evolved to 26 cysts per liter. That model has been studied and refined for 30 years. Those results have been published in several publications, and certainly I encourage anyone who is interested to read these publications. Water management, on the other hand, started in 2010. Now, these initial efforts were started through the studies commissioned by the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council. As a result of these studies and subsequent policy efforts, we are starting to see some drastic changes in Utah water law between 2018 and 2022 that are now allowing us to lease water from water right holders and bring that water to the lake. Then from 2020 to 2023, we see very significant funding of about $673 million towards water conservation. And going forward through mineral leases, we can now rely on additional funding to lease that conserved water as needed. Nutrient management efforts, on the other hand, started in 2012. By 2019, we had developed some really novel nutrient criteria that are based on a combination of numeric and biological criteria. In 2024, we were even able to redirect some nutrient-rich water from a water treatment plant directly into the hypersaline portion of Great Salt Lake, where the nutrients do not cause toxic algal blooms. But frankly, these management actions were all limited. They certainly helped maintain nutrient flow into the lake while protecting freshwater resources, but they were limited in scope. Finally, salinity management efforts started in 2017 with the creation of an adaptive management berm in the connection between the north and south arm of the lake. The north arm of the lake is saturated, while the south arm has a salinity somewhere between 100 and 160 ppt, ideal for Artemia. And by adapting the management berm and moving water from the north to the south and the south to the north, we're now really able to maintain optimal salinity in the south arm of Great Salt Lake. Now, in the next few slides, we want to focus on more recent efforts regarding both nutrient management and water inflow management. So that was a short review of the historic efforts, but what is happening now and what do we hope to achieve in the future? Here, I really need to briefly review in more detail how we manage salinity in the south arm of Great Salt Lake. As mentioned before, the Great Salt Lake is divided by a causeway, a dam, if you will. River inflows are all into the southern part of the lake, really creating a salinity differential between the north and the south. There is an opening, a breach in that dam, creating a connection between the north and the south. And if you would take a cross section of that breach, it looks something like this. Fresh water is flowing into the south arm and it pushes brine through the breach, effectively exporting salt. On the other hand, high density brine in the north has a higher pressure at depth that creates a return flow, effectively importing salt from the north. Now, by managing that breach, we can block the import of salt during drought, or alternatively increase the import of salt during high precipitation years, and as such we can manage the salt load in the south arm of the lake. So moving on to some practical results of this salt management. In the graph you see before you, it shows the relationship between elevation of the lake and salinity of the lake for different salt masses in the south arm. In the x-axis is the lake elevation, and the y-axis the corresponding salinity for a specific salt mass. The orange graph is the salt mass prior to 2021. The blue graph represents the salt mass today. Now, using active salinity management from 2021 through the spring of 2026, during a period of active drought, we were able to export approximately 30% of the salt mass from the south arm to the north arm of Great Salt Lake. At the projected elevation of 4,189 feet for late summer of 2026, we would reach a maximum salinity of 145 ppt shown with that blue dot. Now, had we not been able to export that salt, the salinity would have been above 195 ppt, clearly above the optimal salinity level for Great Salt Lake Artemia. Now let's segue into our recent efforts to study active management of nutrients. This graph that you see in front of you is really similar to the salt mass graph, but now for total nitrogen mass in the lake. In the x-axis, the lake elevation again, in the y-axis, total nitrogen concentration for a specific salt mass. Now, because of nitrogen cycling, atmospheric losses, nitrogen inflows, these graphs are certainly a little bit more variable. Nevertheless, similar to the salt, we also exported a significant quantity of total nitrogen from the south arm to the north arm of Great Salt Lake during that same period. For a net export of 30% of salt, we had a net export of only 9% of total nitrogen. Now, the salinity in the north arm is about twice the salinity of the south. The nitrogen concentration, on the other hand, in the north arm is about 3 times the nitrogen concentration in the south. So we are now studying how we can use the net export differential between salt and nitrogen and net differentials in concentration of salt and nitrogen between north and south in order to maintain both adequate nutrient levels while optimizing salinity in the south arm of Great Salt Lake through both import and export of water between north and south. Enough about nutrients and salt. Let's segue into current water management and water management actions. Okay, we know that salinity and nutrient management are really important, but they're short-term to medium-term solutions that help us create supportive conditions for the Artemia population. On the other hand, in the long term, we still need to bring more water to Great Salt Lake during this period of extreme drought. So in terms of legislative actions, we really had 2 important bills voted into law this year. HB 348, which in summary prioritizes the leases of water rights for the benefit of Great Salt Lake. And then HB 410, which creates additional funding to lease water specifically from agricultural activities at prices similar to the value of an average agricultural crop not being produced. And this is really an important bill because it was created in cooperation with the ag community, therefore creating a lot of trust in the process. Now, in terms of additional funding, we have 3 really important developments. HB 410, as mentioned before, brings an additional $2.75 million in 2027 to lease more water, specifically from agricultural operations. Great Salt Lake Rising, which is a non-profit organization created by Josh Romney and supported by several other prominent Utah families, have committed $200 million in funding from private entities towards Great Salt Lake and really focuses on supporting practical solutions to save the Great Salt Lake. And finally, in the proposed federal budget, U.S. federal budget for 2027, there is an appropriation of $1 billion towards Great Salt Lake. And this budget is not yet finalized, but the current president and administration has shown to be very supportive of actions to save Great Salt Lake. So that's for the funding. I also wanted to show an example of Great Salt Lake Rising, that private nonprofit initiative that really made a difference. And I'll try and explain that. Magnesium Corporation is a mineral company on Great Salt Lake that owns more than 200,000 acre-feet of water rights, and that company went bankrupt. Utah government was interested in purchasing that company because of the associated water rights. But because financial appropriations are a lengthy process, Great Salt Lake Rising, which is a private entity, guaranteed the funding for the government to purchase Magnesium Corporation. At the end, after that purchase facilitated by Great Salt Lake Rising, the Utah government had paid $15 million and the remainder came from Great Salt Lake Rising. But the result is that 144,000 acre-feet of water rights per year are now safeguarded for the lake. In practical terms, that results in a yearly reduction of 60,000 acre-feet in evaporation That amounts to about 12% of Great Salt Lake needs. Additionally, there's an option to use 75,000 acre-feet of water from direct precipitation into the Newfoundland Basin adjacent to the lake, on the condition that we can connect that basin to the Great Salt Lake, but preliminary studies show that's possible. So this is just an example how a private-public partnership can really increase efficiency in protecting Great Salt Lake. So where are we today? You can see from the graph on this slide the year-over-year increase in additional water dedicated and delivered to Great Salt Lake. And the legislative and funding efforts over the last 5 years really resulted in more than 160,000 acre-feet of water dedicated and delivered to Great Salt Lake now on a yearly basis. Certainly not enough yet. We need to get to a 500,000 acre-feet, but a very good start. And frankly, continued efforts through legislation, public funding, private funding initiatives really confirms to us that a continued commitment is there to solving the Great Salt Lake water needs. So as a result of this management, what do we see on the Great Salt Lake? We see the production on the lake has become much more stable over the last 3 decades, as shown here by the trailing 5-year standard deviation in red. But really more importantly, even cyst production has increased significantly by about 30% over the last 30 years. How does that then compare to worldwide cyst production? Well, of course, we're certainly not the only hypersaline lake in the world that brings about efforts to manage a resource. If we look at worldwide cyst production over a similar period of time, the similar period of time that of our efforts on Great Salt Lake, what we see is that a combination of both additional exploration as well as efforts to manage the resources have resulted in significant increase of approximately 30% in overall cyst production over that time period. So to summarize and bring it all together, more than 3 decades of research and focus on sustainable management of Great Salt Lake created a reliable natural Artemia resource and an increase in annual Artemia production. The adaptive management berm is not just a tool to manage salinity, but also appears now to be a tool that we can use to actively manage nutrients on the lake. The current legislative and funding efforts support a continued focus on increasing water supply to Great Salt Lake, and frankly continued efforts into sustainable management of hypersaline systems are really a very important tool to increase natural Artemia supply in support of marine aquaculture. And with that, I really want to thank you for joining. If you have questions, hopefully my colleague Erik van Ballaer and my mentor Professor Sorgelos will try to answer them. But if you have questions that we can immediately answer, I'll certainly be happy to take those questions by email. Thank you very much.